There's a study from 2014 where researchers gave people a choice. They could sit alone in a room with their thoughts for 15 minutes, or they could press a button that would give them a mild electric shock. Most people chose the shock. One man shocked himself 190 times in 15 minutes. He later said he just needed something to happen. That detail has stayed with me, because there's something in it that maps almost perfectly onto how we consume information in the modern world. And specifically, why the information we consistently gravitate toward is almost always bad. Not interesting, not useful, bad. There is something in the human nervous system that finds distress preferable to silence. That detail matters more than we usually let ourselves acknowledge. Think about what you reached for this morning. Within the first 30 minutes of waking, most people have already absorbed a war update, a political crisis, a story about economic collapse, or environmental disaster, or human cruelty. And the strange part, the part nobody talks about, is that this felt unsatisfying on some level. Not pleasant, satisfying. There is a difference, and that difference is worth pulling apart very slowly. The psychologist Roy Baumeister, along with 3 colleagues, published a paper in 2001 with the blunt title, "Bad is Stronger Than Good." It became one of the most cited papers in social psychology. The finding, assembled across dozens of independent studies, is exactly what it sounds like. Bad events have a disproportionately powerful impact on your psychology compared to equivalent good events. Losing $20 feels roughly twice as painful as finding $20 feels good. Bad first impressions require 5 subsequent positive interactions to neutralize. A single cruel comment can undo months of careful encouragement. This isn't a quirk or a cultural artifact. It is a structural feature of how your brain processes the world. The term researchers use is negativity bias, and it runs so deep that it shapes everything from how you remember conversations to which news stories your eyes linger on to what surfaces in your mind at 3 in the morning. It is not something that happens to you occasionally. It is the default setting. But here's where it gets interesting and slightly uncomfortable. Negativity bias is not a flaw in the design. It is the design, one of the most successful features in the entire history of biological survival. Consider what kind of environment your ancestors spent roughly 200,000 years navigating. Every rustle in tall grass was a potential predator. Every stranger was a potential threat. Every unfamiliar smell might mean spoiled food, toxic plants, approaching fire. In that environment, the organism that over-responded to threat, the one that treated every shadow as dangerous, survived at a far higher rate than the organism that under-responded. The cost of a false positive was mild embarrassment. The cost of a false negative was death. Natural selection, across millions of generations, systematically favored brains wired to treat bad news as urgent. What you have in your skull is a threat detection machine running essentially the same threat detection software it ran 200,000 years ago. The problem is that the environment changed radically, and the software didn't update. The structure responsible for most of this is the amygdala, a small almond-shaped cluster of neurons sitting deep in the limbic system. Think of it as your brain's security alarm. It processes incoming information faster than your conscious mind can. Before you have consciously registered that something is wrong, the amygdala has already begun mobilizing a stress response. Cortisol, adrenaline, elevated heart rate, sharpened sensory attention. The full emergency protocol triggers in roughly 180 milliseconds. Neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux mapped this architecture in detail. There are 2 pathways by which sensory information reaches the amygdala: a fast route direct from the thalamus, bypassing the cortex entirely, and a slower route through the prefrontal cortex where rational evaluation can occur. The fast route gets the information there first. Always. Your emotional response to a threat-relevant stimulus precedes your rational assessment of it by a meaningful margin. Daniel Goleman, drawing on Ledoux's work, called the extreme version of this an amygdala hijack. Moments when the emotional brain so completely overrides the rational brain that deliberate thought becomes functionally unavailable. Now here's what makes this particularly relevant to bad news. Research by psychologist Paul Slovic on the effect heuristic shows that when we process information, emotional responses do most of the evaluative work before our rational faculties have even entered the picture. We don't assess a news story and then feel disturbed. We feel the disturbance first, and the assessment comes after, largely as a rationalization of a judgment already made emotionally. Reasoning, in these cases, is not the driver. It is the press secretary. And the news industry, with or without explicit malice, figured this out long before neuroscience confirmed it. The old line in broadcast journalism, if it bleeds, it leads, isn't just cynicism. It is an accurate description of what moves the human nervous system. Threat-relevant information captures and holds attention in ways that neutral or positive information simply cannot. A story about a fire in a neighborhood you've never visited will anchor your attention more powerfully than a story about a school that successfully taught children to read. Not because the fire is more important, but because your amygdala assigned it higher urgency before you could form an opinion about it. George Gerbner spent decades at the Annenberg School, studying something he called cultivation theory. His central finding was this: heavy television viewers developed a perception of the world that matched television content rather than statistical reality. Specifically, they dramatically overestimated crime rates, violence, and danger. They described the world as more threatening than it measurably was. Gerbner called this the mean world syndrome. The more bad news you consume, the more dangerous the world feels, entirely independently of whether the world has actually become more dangerous. This is where things get genuinely strange, because the question isn't only why bad news captures attention, it's why we return to it. Why, knowing that doom scrolling makes us anxious and miserable, we continue to doom scroll. Why bad news feels not just compelling but, in some uncomfortable way, necessary. Part of the answer is uncertainty. When something bad happens and you don't fully understand it, your brain registers that epistemic gap as a threat in itself. Not knowing is dangerous. The drive to keep consuming information about a bad event is partly the drive to resolve that gap, to reach a point of understanding sufficient to predict, and therefore potentially survive the thing. The problem is that news rarely closes gaps. It continuously reopens them. Each update introduces new uncertainty, which requires more consumption to resolve, which introduces more uncertainty. This is structurally identical to a variable reward loop, the exact mechanism that makes gambling addictive. The resolution you are seeking is always one more article away. Behavioral neuroscientist Ken Berridge, in meticulous studies on rat behavior, drew a distinction that changed how researchers think about reward. He separated wanting from liking. The dopamine system drives wanting, the anticipation of reward, the craving, the compulsive seeking. But dopamine is not primarily responsible for liking, the actual pleasure of receiving the reward. These are separate systems, and the wanting system is more powerful than the liking system. You can be locked in a wanting loop that never produces the satisfaction you're seeking, because satisfaction and wanting are anatomically distinct processes. The wanting continues regardless. It does not require reward. It requires only the possibility of reward. Bad news plugs directly into the wanting system. The amygdala detects threat. The system mobilizes attention and information seeking. You reach for more. The resolution doesn't come. And so you reach again. The machinery is working exactly as it was designed. It was just designed for a different world. Watch this play out in everyday life rather than laboratories, and the picture gets both clearer and more depressing. In workplaces, negative feedback is remembered more accurately and for longer than positive feedback, meaning that the critical comment your manager made 8 months ago remains sharper in your memory than 30 instances of praise. This is not weakness or sensitivity. This is negativity bias operating precisely as engineered. Interrelationships. Researcher John Gottman's longitudinal studies on couples identified what he called the magic ratio. Roughly 5 positive interactions needed to counterbalance every single negative one, just to maintain baseline relationship satisfaction. One serious argument can deplete an account that months of warmth took to build. The negative has more gravitational pull. The math is always asymmetrical. In social media, platforms discovered early that outrage, anxiety, and fear drove engagement more reliably than joy or inspiration. A 2021 study from New York University's Center for Social Media and Politics found that posts with negative emotional content received substantially more engagement than neutral posts. The algorithm learned this pattern. It optimized for it relentlessly. So when you open a social platform and the world appears to be collapsing, the world may not actually be collapsing, but the system has been calibrated to maximize the sensation that it is, because that sensation keeps you in the feed and in public discourse more broadly. Negativity bias means that political messaging built around threat, loss, and danger is structurally more effective than messaging built around hope or gain. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's prospect theory demonstrated this rigorously over decades. People will accept more risk to avoid a loss than to achieve an equivalent gain. Loss is louder than gain. Politicians and marketers have always intuited this. Now they have the behavioral data to engineer it systematically. So what does this mean for you? Not in the abstract, but specifically, personally. First, recognize that your relationship with bad news is not a matter of character. You are not weak or anxious or pessimistic because difficult news grips your attention. That grip is the product of 200,000 years of selection pressure operating through your nervous system. The architecture was installed long before you were born. It is not a personal failing. It is a design choice made by evolution, under conditions that no longer apply. But recognizing that does not mean you're helpless. Psychologist Martin Seligman, whose early career documented how organisms exposed to uncontrollable stressors eventually stop trying to escape even when escape becomes available, a phenomenon he called learned helplessness, later spent decades studying what he called learned optimism. His point, which cuts against the usual self-help version of the message, is not that positive thinking works. It's that certain explanatory stylism, the way you habitually interpret the cause and permanence of negative events, are more or less adaptive. Catastrophizing, universalizing bad events, treating them as permanent and all-encompassing, is a learned cognitive pattern. It is not identical to intelligence or realism, and it can be interrupted. What interrupting it does not look like: consumption limits you resent and abandon inside a week, or forced positivity that the amygdala sees straight through. What it looks like, in practice: learning to notice the difference between information that equips you to act and information that only feeds the uncertainty loop. These are genuinely different experiences in the body, even when they arrive through the same medium. The distinction is not always clean, but the signal is real. Information that equips leaves something clarified, even when it's disturbing. The uncertainty loop feels like urgency without a target, like scanning for a threat you can't locate, like checking a lock a 4th time because checking it 3 times resolved nothing, and you already know the 4th time won't either. Here is what I find most interesting and most unsettling about all of this. The negativity bias is real. The threat detection machinery is ancient and powerful. The news industry's exploitation of it is documented and ongoing. The algorithmic amplification is intentional and measurably harmful to mood, judgment, and political reasoning. All of that is verifiable. And yet, there's something in the human compulsion toward darkness that I don't think is fully explained by evolutionary neuroscience. Dostoevsky wrote about characters who could not stop returning to what tortured them, not because they wanted relief, but because the pain felt like evidence of their own reality. The underground man suffers not despite his intelligence, but because of it. He is fully aware of his irrationality and cannot stop. Yes? That is a different problem from a mismatched threat detection algorithm. That is something else. There is a version of bad news consumption that functions the same way. The darkness confirms that the world is serious, that you are serious, that reality has weight. Pure positivity, in its cultural form, has a kind of weightlessness that feels suspect, and not entirely without reason. The bad news feels true, in a way that good news often doesn't. There is something in the human appetite for darkness that is not reducible to fear. That instinct, the instinct that awareness of threat is more honest than peace, that darkness is more sophisticated than light, deserves scrutiny, not dismissal. Scrutiny, because the question is not whether the world contains darkness. It obviously does. The question is whether compulsive consumption of its representation, optimized for engagement by people who profit from your cortisol, produces clarity, or whether it produces a feeling of proximity to reality. That is, itself, a kind of comfortable illusion. Whether the man watching the news at midnight is actually more informed, or whether he is doing something more like pressing a button to feel something happening. The brain that evolved to track threats across a savanna is now trying to track threats across an entire planet, in real time, continuously, with no mechanism to determine when enough information is enough. It was not designed for that scale. It cannot process information at that volume without significant distortion. And the distortion runs in one direction, always toward threat, always toward danger, always toward the conviction that things are worse than they are and getting worse still. Understanding this does not fix anything. There is no clean resolution here, no technique that reverses 200,000 years of selection pressure. But it does change the quality of your relationship with the noise. It makes it harder to confuse the machinery of fear with the experience of being awake. And that, honestly, is a less comfortable place to stand, but a more accurate one.